In October 2025, biologists waded into the Cuyahoga River at 3 sites in Ohio and released over 2,000 lake sturgeon fingerlings into water that once caught fire. These fish had been gone for more than a century. 2,000 juveniles, each the length of a finger. A river that burned. A species that can outlive any person alive today. They came back anyway. The Cuyahoga does not look like a river that once embarrassed a nation. It runs quiet now through Cleveland, cold and brown under the bridges, carrying silt the way a working river should. But in 1969 it burned. Flames climbed high enough to scorch the steel above it. The photographs ran in Time magazine, and the country finally looked at what it had done to its own water. That fire became the image that moved Congress. Within 3 years, the Clean Water Act was signed. The Cuyahoga was no longer a symptom, it was evidence. Decades of recovery work followed. Sewage treatment plants were built. Industrial discharge was cut. The river, that once smelled of petroleum and dye, began slowly to smell like a river again. But the sturgeon did not come back on their own. A fish that can live past 100 years and grow longer than a man is tall does not simply wander home. It needs someone to carry it there. That is what the programme's biologists did. More than 750 of those fingerlings were placed at the most upstream site, pushing the fish as far into the watershed as the data suggested the river could hold. Each fingerling was the length of a finger. Each one carried a biological blueprint for a creature that could outlive the scientist who placed it in the water. That is not a metaphor. It is a life history fact. The programme's goal is roughly 1,500 spawning adults by 2049. Nobody alive today can guarantee they will witness that number. The scientists who designed this release almost certainly will not. In 2024, a pilot cohort of about 60 tagged juveniles went in first. A probe cast into the unknown to test whether the river would accept them at all. The Cuyahoga gave no immediate answer. What the field teams recorded from that pilot group, the survival rates, the movement patterns, the depth preferences, pointed towards something the river's chemistry alone could not have predicted. A river that burned now carries a species older than the bridges above it. The water is not pristine. It does not need to be. It only needs to be enough. And whether it is, the fish are already deciding. The gravel beds are still there. You can see them through the surface on a clear morning. Pale, rounded stones, arranged by current, exactly the kind of substrate a spawning adult would have pressed its body against. Nobody living has ever seen that happen here. That is what ecological absence looks like from the bank. The cleanup made the Cuyahoga visible again. Cleaner, greener, no longer a hazard. What it could not restore, and what no water quality index measures, was the structural vacancy left by a species that had been gone for generations. Industrial discharge came first. Decades of it, steadily poisoning the bottom sediments where a bottom-feeding benthic animal spends most of its life. Navigation dams followed, blocking upstream migration corridors that lake sturgeon had used for thousands of years. Then, commercial overfishing finished the work, collapsing what little remained before anyone thought to count it. Listen to what that absence looked like, location by location. At the most upstream release site, more than 750 animals entered a stretch that had held no documented wild individual in living memory. The gravel beds undisturbed, the spawning architecture intact but abandoned. Downstream, At 2 additional release sites chosen for the 2025 programme, the substrate had gone untouched by the rooting behaviour of a large benthic animal for generations. The riverbed had, in the most literal sense, forgotten what one does to it. Where the Cuyahoga empties into Lake Erie, the species persists in marginal numbers, but no longer reproduces in the tributary system it once depended on. The pipeline between nursery and adult population had been severed. Across the broader Great Lakes Basin, Lake Sturgeon now occupy a fraction of their historical range, a region-wide contraction that makes every single tributary restoration count more, not less. 3 separate forces: discharge, dams, overfishing, each capable of suppression on its own, acted in combination across more than 100 years. No single restoration event undoes that arithmetic. The gravel beds remember nothing. The species has to relearn the system from scratch. A large benthic animal does something specific to a riverbed. It roots, it turns substrate, it oxygenates sediment layers that would otherwise compact and go anoxic. Remove that behaviour for long enough, and the bed reorganises itself around the absence. Macroinvertebrate communities shift. Egg-laying habitat degrades. The whole benthic architecture drifts toward a different equilibrium. This is the part that made me stop and reread the field notes. The 2025 release sites were not chosen because the habitat was ideal. They were chosen because the habitat was recoverable, a meaningful distinction and a harder one to defend to a budget committee. The tagged cohort from the year before had already shown that the animals could navigate the system, moving downstream, holding in deeper pools, feeding on the invertebrate communities the cleanup had allowed to rebuild. What the tags could not record was whether any of those animals would eventually return upstream to spawn. That return takes decades. The programme's biologist released animals that will outlive them. A species capable of living past a century, reintroduced into a system it abandoned before any living person was born. The timeline of accountability here extends well beyond a single career, a single grant cycle, or a single administration. The river looked recovered. It was missing its architect. Legislation cleaned the water. That is not a small thing. Chemical loads that once made the Cuyahoga unbreathable at the surface dropped to levels where insects returned, and where insects returned, fish followed. But the law stopped there, at the waterline. No discharge permit reaches into the riverbed and reorganises gravel. No regulation re-engineers a substrate that spent generations compacted and unworked. The architecture of a functional spawning ground is not written into any compliance schedule. It is built by the animal that uses it, over decades of physical occupation. You cannot legislate a fish back into existence. That is what the monitoring teams confirmed after the pilot cohort went in. The tagged juveniles did not struggle with water chemistry. They struggled with nothing the biologists could measure. The water held them. The gap was never the water. It was always the absence of the animal itself. A sturgeon makes 3 demands of any rivie it occupies: gravel cold enough to slow its metabolism through winter, current strong enough to carry oxygen across its gills, and time. More time than any single management cycle ever budgets for. The Cuyahoga had the first 2. The programme's biologists supplied the third, not by waiting, but by physically placing the animal back into the water that was ready to receive it. Here is where the data stops being data and becomes something else entirely. The program's monitoring teams now track juveniles in a river where the species has been functionally absent for generations. Growth rates are coming in, habitat use is being mapped. What those tags cannot yet confirm is whether the animals are orienting, whether the navigational chemistry that pulls an adult back to its natal gravel is even intact after this many absent generations. That mechanism has never been tested in this drainage. The program's target, roughly 1,500 spawning adults, sits at the far end of a timeline that extends past the careers of everyone currently running the telemetry. The fish released in October 2025 will still be alive when the people who tagged them are not. That is not a poetic observation. It is a logistical fact that changes how accountability works in conservation. And how rarely we are honest about it. A century of management built a river clean enough to sustain life. What it could not build was a population. That work belongs to the fish now, and to whoever is standing on these banks in 2 generations, reading data collected by people they will never meet. That cartilaginous snout is not ornamental. It is a tool, a broad, flexible probe the sturgeon drags across the substrate, dislodging sediment with each pass, opening the bed to oxygen and light in a way no other species in this system replicates. Within hours of that disturbance, macroinvertebrates move in, not gradually, almost immediately, because the gravel pocket the sturgeon exposed is exactly the microhabitat those organisms have been locked out of by a century of compacted silt pressing down from above. The sequence runs in a fixed order every time. The snout breaks the seal, nutrients rise into the column, invertebrates colonize the exposed gravel, and every insect-dependent species sharing this stretch quietly inherits a thicker prey base. None of that cascade appeared on a monitoring report in the first weeks. It does not announce itself. It runs beneath the surface, in the dark, in the cold, the way a process runs when it does not need permission. The sturgeon is not a passenger in this system. It is the mechanism. What the 2025 release set in motion is a chain the Cuyahoga has not run in more than a century. Bottom disturbance returning, water clarity shifting, the mid-column prey base quietly thickening for species that have no idea why their conditions just improved. The field teams documented the release. They are tracking the tagged cohort. What they cannot yet resolve is whether the gravel beds themselves, compressed under decades of sedimentation above navigation dams, are structurally intact enough to hold a spawning event. Are the gravel beds intact enough to support spawning? That is the load-bearing question the program is now carrying forward. The program's long-term targets depend entirely on whether the substrate that was here before the dams is still workable beneath what the dams left behind. Stay with this, because everything downstream of the 2025 release runs through 3 conditions the program cannot manufacture. Intact gravel beds, deep enough for spawning, a population dense enough to locate one another, and enough undisturbed decades for the cycle to close. The fish do not know about the dams. They will prospect the bottom, the way their lineage has for 150 million years, rooting, disturbing, moving on. What they find when they get to those sedimented reaches will tell us something no monitoring plan was designed to ask. The biologists who tagged the pilot cohort, who walked the release banks, who argued over upstream placement, they filed their reports and went home to the same calendar everyone else lives on. The fish did not. A lake sturgeon reaches sexual maturity somewhere between 15 and 25 years in, depending on the individual and the temperature and the food the river actually provides. That is not an estimate the program can compress. It is the animal's own clock, and it runs without negotiation, which means the fish that entered the Cuyahoga in October 2025 will not turn towards spawning until the 2040s at the earliest. That gap is not a flaw in the plan, it is the biology. Think about what that arithmetic actually requires. The program needs its institutional memory to hold for 2 full decades, across budget cycles, across administrations, across the quiet years when nothing dramatic happens and the river simply runs. Funding cycles run on 2 and 4 year intervals. Administrations change their priorities. A river restoration with no visible yield for 15 years is exactly the kind of program that gets quietly defunded when the headlines move on. The friction here is not ecological, it is institutional. The animal's biology outpaces 3 things the program cannot lock in: the memory of why this matters, the money to keep monitoring, and the political will to leave the river alone long enough for the cycle to close. The river does not care about the budget cycle. It will move the way it moves, clearing sediment in flood years, depositing it in dry ones, shifting the bottom the fish will eventually read. That negotiation happens whether anyone is watching or not. Some of the scientists who designed this release will not be alive to see those fish attempt their first spawn. That is not a tragedy. It is the honest shape of the commitment they made. The target of 1,500 spawning adults by 2049 is not an optimistic projection. It is a biological flaw, the minimum density below which self-sustaining reproduction becomes statistically fragile. Below it, the population cannot replace itself. It simply thins until it disappears. 2049 is not a finish line. It is the earliest moment the program can even ask whether it worked. Everything before that is tending a fire nobody gets to see burn. What no management plan addresses is who keeps watch in the quiet middle years, the winters when the telemetry pings and nobody publishes, when the fish are simply growing in a river that once burned, on a schedule that belongs entirely to them. Those quiet winters, the telemetry tracks, the pings arriving on schedule, the data logged, nothing published, that is not absence. That is a body doing the only thing a body knows how to do: grow toward the moment it was built for. The field notes from Act 2, the detail that made me stop and read them twice, recorded something the team had not predicted. The juveniles did not hold at the release sites. Within weeks, they had moved upstream, following thermal gradients in the sediment, navigating a channel their lineage had not touched in over a century. The team never isolated the precise cue: temperature, chemistry, current signature. What the surveys recorded is the outcome. The fish moved as though the route had always been there. Because for them, it had. The Cuyahoga did not recover because someone believed in it. It recovered because the pressure was removed. Full stop. The water did what water does when you stop poisoning it. It found its equilibrium. And over 2,000 sturgeon now carry that equilibrium forward on a schedule that belongs to the animal, not to any office that funded it. Nobody alive today will see this project close. The scientists who waded in on that October morning released animals that will outlive them. That is not a tragedy. That is the correct scale for the work. The sturgeon is the next step in the same physics the river already proved. Remove the absence and the system resumes. Drop your region in the comments And name one species you have personally watched disappear from your local water, your local woods, your local sky in your own lifetime. And yes or no in the comments, have you ever seen something come back that you were certain was gone for good? Because if the answer is yes, I want to hear that story. Share this with someone who still believes the damage is permanent, the evidence says otherwise, and you are holding it. Next, wolves were returned to the mountains of Colorado in 2023 and 2024, and within a single winter, the elk movement patterns that had been static for decades began to shift. The Colorado Farm Bureau challenged the reintroduction through the courts in 2024, arguing livestock loss made continuation untenable, and that legal friction slowed monitoring access precisely when the trophic cascade was beginning to move. What the elk do to the riverbanks when something is chasing them again, what that does to the cottonwood, what the cottonwood does to the beaver, what the beaver does to the water, is a sequence that was always going to happen. The river does not wait for the ruling.